Okay, our topic tonight is going to be on advance here, controlling pest safely. One of the concepts, terms that you will come across in your Master Gardening Handbook is Integrated Pest Management, IPM. And we're going to talk a little bit about the steps for integrated pest management and some things to think about when you're using a pesticide. We're going to start with defining pesticide. Pesticide is, well, a plant or an animal that harms humans or human concerns is a pest. And then the prefix side means the killing of. So this is any chemical substance that will kill a pest. And I've presented this at a couple other master gardening programs over the last 2 to 3 years, and the question always comes up, well, I use organic or I use something else. Well, if it's not a hoe that you're grubbing the weed out with, it's a chemical that you're applying, whether it be something very basic and relatively safe, or whether it be a chemical that you buy at a garden supply center for the purpose of killing that pest, it's still considered a pesticide. And there's some things that you need to be thinking about, some things to consider when applying those pesticides in the right direction. Before we begin, I came across this quote some time ago. It says, if you know both yourself and your enemy, you can win numerous battles without jeopardy. And it is a Chinese proverb. And when it comes to managing pests, that's a good philosophy to have. Because if you know what you can tolerate for the pest, okay, one weed's not going to be a problem. One bug might not be a problem. And then you know what that weed is, or that bug or insect is, then you can make a decision as to whether or not you need to take drastic measures or if there is something basic. So the question comes down to, is the pest control really necessary? So we talked a little bit about pest and identifying the pest last week. And this happens to be a tobacco hornworm, which on tomatoes is a pest that you need to be concerned with. So knowing your pest and being able to identify, as we discussed last week, is going to be the first step in trying to decide if that pest is going to be a real problem or not. So first step is identifying the pest, and then thinking about the methods that you need to control that pest. And there are 3 basic steps in pest control: prevention, suppression, and eradication. And prevention is just as the name implies, keeping that pest out. It may be fencing for deer, rabbits, or other things that might come into your garden. Prevention may also apply to weeds. There's also suppression, and weeds are another where we try to suppress with a mulch of some kind. We try to keep them from growing to the point that they are a problem. In applying herbicides for weeds or putting down mulch for weeds would fall in this category of suppression. And then the final is eradication. And my picture actually covers the wording. But the eradication is completely eliminating the pest from the area. In your lawn and garden, that is impossible. It's really not something that you're going to be able to achieve outside. There's opportunity for more pests to come in. However, we looked at household pests last week: termites, roaches, whatever might happen to be coming in the house. And eradication is possible there, and probably needs to be the goal in some cases with those pests. So those are the 3 steps, or the 3 ways in which you can control pests. Now, I introduced this term, integrated pest management, when we started. And there are steps in the plan for this integrated pest management. Excuse me. The first one is, as we noted, is to identify the pests. Then understand what control methods are available. Then evaluate the risk and benefits. What are the risks of using this control method? What is the risk of the pest? What benefits will I achieve if I use this particular control method? Choose your strategy. If it's one weed popping up in the garden, then it might be just as simple to pull the weed as it would be to try to find a chemical that would control it. Then when it comes to using pesticides in particular, there's going to be state and federal laws in particular that will apply to their use. So know what's allowed and what the regulations and the rules say you can do. And this is a timeline, if you will, and it's in a circle because no matter where you come into this process, it's just a continued cycle. So this is the planting time. So if we start with the planting, then the next is to forecast. What pest problems could I have? What's the weather like? If we had a little cold snap a couple of nights ago. That could cause problems. It could damage plants. It could weaken plants to allow other pests to become a problem. Then the next would be pest tracking, and this may be a process or a set of steps that you take to see what's there, to help monitor. And monitoring can also be trapping, but it could also be just inspecting your plants, looking for the pests that you know you may have problems, or it's the time of year for, or that have been problems in the past. Then it mentions thresholds. At what point does that pest become a problem? 1 or 2 might not be a problem. You know, if it's Japanese beetles in the spring of the year, well, June, July, when they start coming out, then, you know, there's going to be lots of them. They're going to be a problem. So monitoring the level and determining when that pest actually becomes a problem. Then start with the different methods. Cultural controls, which shows a picture of someone pulling a weed, and that may be a simple method. Cultural controls, there's cultural controls for insects as well. And there's some cultural controls for diseases. One of the things you can do for tomato blight is rotating your crop, or mulching so that the soil doesn't splash up on the lower leaves. And then if you do see blight starting to appear on the leaves, remove those leaves and remove them completely from the garden. And just slowly monitor the process. And if it becomes a little more of a problem, there are biological controls. You know, you can encourage beneficial insects, even birds that may come to your garden and eat the insects that are causing problems. Then the last step in control would be to use a chemical control, something that you would purchase to solve the problem. And that's, if you notice, cultural first, then biological, and then chemical controls is the sequence. So using chemicals is our last step in controlling pests. Keeping records. When did you see the problem in the past? What problems have you had in the past? Weather, you know, is it a damp, wet spring? If it's a damp, wet spring, then the certain diseases could, particularly blights, could be a problem. We got a email from Dr. Lockwood a couple of days ago, well, at the end of last week. This weather that we had over this past weekend with a little chance of freeze and then it being damp, fire blight could be a problem in some areas. I think most of us, if we didn't get a frost Saturday, Sunday, probably avoided the worst possible scenario for that problem, but it is still possible. Then we start the soil preparation, some tillage methods that may help break up the cycle of weeds and some insects. And then we're back to planting where we actually started. And I didn't mention planting, what we need to do there, but choosing varieties that are disease resistant. Choosing the right plants can make a big difference in whether or not you can be successful. So those are the steps in integrated pest management. Now, pesticides come in a variety of different things, and each of the terms would apply for something different. Insecticides kill insects, whereas miticides would be controlling mites. Nematicides are for controlling nematodes, fungicides for fungi and bactericides, or antibiotics. It's another term that's often used for bacteria. Herbicides are for killing plants. Then there's rodenticides, the little packs of bait that you can buy to put out for mice and rats. And then the arachnicides, killing spiders, scorpions. Pesticides, there is things that are used to kill fish, particularly in areas where fish are a nuisance. And that does occur if you've been paying attention to the news with some of the Asian carp that have escaped and are causing problems in the river system, particularly along the Mississippi River. That there are fish that can be invasive and problematic. And then the last one is for the purpose of controlling birds. And pesticides and the types come in different forms and react and act differently when they're used. They're plant growth regulators. They either stop the plant from growing, they may actually cause the plant to grow faster, or change something in the growth process of that plant. If you've ever used 2,4-D to control lawn weeds, you notice the plant may look like it grows for a day or two after application, and then it starts wilting, and it actually speeds up the growth process, and the plant outgrows itself in its ability to keep up with itself. Then there are defoliants, which actually remove leaves and stems, and they do not often kill the roots. Now, a lot of times, and this is something to think about, if you buy these weed killers that promise overnight killing of the weed, well, that may be exactly what the chemical does, is defoliate the weed. And in 24 hours often, they will kill the top part of the plant. But if it happens to be a perennial weed, the roots may actually survive. There are repellents. Mothballs is probably the first repellent that actually comes to mind. And then there are attractants, where you actually attract the pest to a trap. That's not always the best recommended because you are bringing the pest in, but they can be used as a monitoring tool. And there are some pests where trapping can work, particularly rodents. And they work in various ways. There are contact poisons, those that actually need to come in contact with the pest. In several of our lawn and garden pesticides, such as Roundup, or weed control 2,4-D, even the insecticides need to come in contact with the pest. There are stomach poisons that they can be applied, and then the pests, particularly insects, will need to ingest poison. The systemic poisons are taken usually in through the skin and into the bloodstream, and then takes effect. Actually, Roundup is considered a systemic herbicide. It's absorbed into the plant's tissues and then affects the growth of the plant. There are some systemic insecticides as well. Fumigants is a way of applying this. This is one of the gases that need to be inhaled. And when you fumigate a house in particular, that's actually what you're doing. When you hear the term selective herbicides or selective pesticides, they're targeting certain pests. 2,4-D is considered a selective herbicide. It kills broadleaf plants. It does not affect grasses. Non-selective kills most all plants and animals. And Roundup is an excellent example of a non-selective herbicide. If it's green and it gets a full enough dose, it will kill the plant that has been sprayed. And the last term at the bottom on the left is translocated herbicides. And this is a term for pesticides that have moved from the point of application. And the plant may be sprayed on the leaf and stem, but the roots are the part of the plant that is actually being affected by the herbicide. It just absorbs it and translocates it through the plant to the part that it will eventually affect. So there are various functions of these pesticides, and there's a lot of ways in which pesticides can be applied. There's a broadcast application, which means an entire area is covered either by scattering or spraying the pesticide. For most lawn and garden applications, broadcast would be that drastic step that you would take to control a pest. If you have a rub problem in your yard and it's killing the grass, then a broadcast application may be necessary. Broadcast application may be necessary if you have a lot of weeds, but a more direct spot spraying or spot application to the particular problem would be a lot more effective on the small scale for a lawn and garden. Cracks and crevices, this would apply particularly with a household pest. If you ever watched an exterminator work, they don't spray the whole house, they'll go around to cracks and crevices. So a small amount of pesticides applied to that area where the insects in particular might be hiding or may find a way into a building. A directed application is aimed directly at the plant, the animal, or the building if you're spraying your house, and you're applying specifically on the problem spot. And then drench is where you saturate soils with a pesticide. In drenches, we often recommend mostly for fire ant. About the only time we recommend the drench application. Some drench applications may be applicable for yellow jackets, for example. Something that is a problem or can be a problem and that will be in the ground. There's foliar applications where you're spraying the leaves of the plants. There may be applications where you, particularly in a pre-plant application, would spray in the furrow or in the area where the plant will be applied. You could side dress, which means you go along the side of the road or side of the plant and make the application. That applies particularly with fertilizer, but there are some cases where a pesticide is applied by the side dress method. And the last one I've actually already mentioned, which is a spot treatment. A small area of a crop or yard or garden is targeted with your application. And as I said, that's probably the most effective method for a lawn and garden. When you identify the pest and you realize you're going to have a problem, is target that pest right then, right there, and then monitor to see if it has moved or causing problems elsewhere. There's a lot of factors, whether you're using an organic method or a chemical method for pest control, excuse me, that will affect the performance of that pesticide. When you apply, the timing of that application is absolutely critical. The timing is particularly important with weeds. If you have a weed problem in your yard now, particularly dandelions or chickweed or henbit, the little purple flowers that's popping up right now, which is a dead nettle. or henbit, and they are in bloom right now. Well, the best application time would have been back at Halloween. So back in October would have been the time to have treated your yard for those. Crabgrass, the application probably should be made about now, because we are warming up and the soil temperature is warming up. But if you miss the timing on the crabgrass and it sprouts, then chances are you've missed your window for having the best effect for applying a pesticide. And understanding the pest's life cycle in its movements, and just understanding when is the best time and what stage of that pest's development would be a good time to apply. And actually, the two things that come to mind as an example for this would be, first of all, I showed you the cushiony scale on the hollies that were at the library last week. And there were little brown spots that showed all the crawlers. Well, that's a perfect time for a pesticide application or control method to be applied. Once those crawlers develop into the next stage and they start developing that scale, that little cushiony scale that we're beginning to see on those holly leaves, then they're fairly well armored and fairly well protected from the pesticide. So understanding when is very important. For weeds, the only thing that really comes to mind as an example would be thistle. When it's low to the ground and right flat to the ground, it's a good time to control it. Once it bolts and starts blooming, then it's pretty hard to control with a herbicide. And the correct pesticide is also important. First of all, it needs to be labeled for the insect or weed and the crop or plant that you're trying to grow. So it needs, for example, crabgrass control in a lawn, you need to have it labeled for the type of lawn that you have. It needs to be labeled for crabgrass. So selecting the right chemical is also very important. Weather can be a big factor. Most of the pesticide applications require at least a day's window of dry weather for it to work. You don't want to apply your chemical and then an hour or two later get a good thunder shower come through and wash everything away. Storage life of the pesticide can be a critical factor as well. Just like anything else, the older it is, the less effective it will be. And proper storage is also important. You just can't set it out in the garage with freeze. It needs to be in a cool, dry place where the temperature is relatively constant throughout the winter. So proper storage and proper handling when it's not being used is important as well. And pest resistance can be an issue. Colorado potato beetle that we looked at last week and trying to identify. Some of the methods of control may not be as effective as others. So realize that there are going to be some pests that are a little more difficult to control with some methods than others. So just understanding all the things that are happening, and that's where identifying your pest comes into play. Once you've identified the pest, then it's awfully easy to look up and research and find the best control method. Pesticides come in a variety of formulations. So when you go to the store and you look on the label, there's all these letters and numbers, symbols that mean different things. Some of that does not necessarily matter a whole lot on the lawn and garden scale because they don't have a lot of different formulations. But there are emulsified concentrates, which are labeled whatever the chemical name is, followed by the letters E or EC. And it's usually an oil-based carrier. And a lot of these oil-based carriers or the emulsified concentrates are not labeled for edible crops because of the oil-based carrier. Solutions, there are pre-mixed and ready to use, which can be awful convenient and handy, and if you're looking at a small scale, may actually be a choice to think about, because if you don't want to store the chemical or you're not going to need a whole lot of it, then you might be willing to pay a few extra dollars for something that you can use and dispose then of the empty container and not have the product. A lot of times those ready-to-use mixes are fairly expensive in comparison to buying a concentrate and mixing your own. There's flowables, or even a liquid, where the liquid formulation is mixed with water as the carrier. Typically forms a suspension in a tank or a sprayer, where the best way to describe that would be something in suspension would be like putting flour or meal. It'll float in the water, but it's not really dissolved by the tank mix. So the water becomes the carrier and not necessarily dissolved into the water. You can buy aerosols, which are fine mist and spray. A lot of home pest control methods use aerosol cans. You can buy dust, which is a fine powder, almost like talcum powder. Sivin is a brand name or a common name for a chemical that often comes in a 5 or 10% dust that you can dust the plants with, or the area around the plants, depending on what your problem is, for insect control. There's granules, which is a coarse material, often used to apply pesticides, whether they be herbicides or an insecticide, to turf. And the chemical is then activated when it comes in contact with the soil. Wettable powders. It looks a whole lot like the dust as far as the material and what it looks like, but they're in higher concentrations and they are designed to be mixed with water. So you would measure dry ingredients into the water and then mix them thoroughly. Problem with wettable powders on a small scale is you really need to keep the powder in suspension in the water in your tank, and that's awfully hard to do without some regular agitation of the sprayer. Soluble powders is a little different grain or coarse material, so the powder is still soluble, and in this case it often completely dissolves in the water. So it actually, like sugar, dissolves easily in water. Base, the active ingredient, is in an edible substance. So there's a variety of ways in which the chemical can be delivered. There's also things that can be added to the tank that will increase the effectiveness of the spray. And most all pesticide formulations contain a small amount of these adjuvants already, something that will help the process. A lot of times what these are something very similar to a detergent or soap that will help break the water's cohesion. So the water, instead of beating up on the plant leaf, will actually spread out on the leaf of a plant for a herbicide, for example. So it actually helps or aids in the effectiveness of the product. And the surfactants also work in the same way. This is breaks the surface tension as well of the materials. It also helps keep some of the materials that are not compatible, such as the solubles, or not the solubles, those items that go into suspension. They'll help them stay in suspension longer without a lot of agitation. And adding a surfactant, something that actually sticks or causes the herbicide to stick, it's really good when applying to a surface that is slick or waxy. So if you've got a weed problem that has a waxy leaf or a really thick cuticle on the leaf, then the surfactant would help improve the effectiveness of the chemical. It could also be effective in applying insecticides to those waxy leaf plants such as iris, yews, azaleas, where it can be hard to get the foliage wet because they shed water. You need to be careful because if you get too much of that and it turns off to a nice sunny day, you can defoliate your rose bush. Speaking from experience, just read the label and pay attention to what the label says if it is necessary. Most of the things that you would buy for lawn and garden use already have things mixed in to improve the effectiveness, and there's no need to add a lot of surfactants or other materials. The pesticide label is very important. And I know they're practically booklets, but there is a lot of important information that's there from the company. And this labeling is on or attached to the container. And it is the instructions that need to be followed. In fact, the label is considered a legal document, and failure to follow the label means that you are not following the law. So I would recommend when you buy chemicals that you take that little booklet off and read it. Actually look at it very carefully. It tells you what's there, who made it, and we'll go into all this, but it's very important that you consider. So everything you need to know about that pesticide is listed. And as already noted, read and follow the directions. And safety concerns and then safety issues and what safety equipment, types of sprayers are all listed on those labels. So as you start down the label and look, and I'll actually pull up a label or two here in a second and point out some of these, you'll find the brand name or the trade name. You'll also find the type of formulation, those letters that we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the active ingredient. And people will call and say, well, I sprayed, and they'll give me a brand name or a company that I bought Bayer and sprayed my tree. Well, what was the active ingredient? Because that's the important part of it. Now, that could be the common name or the chemical name for the plant. Civin is a brand name or trade name. Carboxyl is the common name for the chemical. Tells you the net contents, how much is in the container. Is it a pint? Is it a gallon? How many ounces? Pounds for some of the dust. Who made it? And then there's the EPA registration number, which tells you that that chemical has been approved by the Environmental Protection Agency. And the establishment number, which tells you where and what and who made it. And very specifically, who, what, when, where, and how it was made. There's precautionary statements, what safety equipment you would need to use, how the pesticide can be used, the crops it can be applied to, locations it can be applied to, how to mix it, and all the specifics on how to use it. The environmental hazard statement just tells you the potential problems that if misused and what can be of concern. It also tells you how to properly dispose of the chemical. Very few of you will run into restricted use pesticides, but these are pesticides where you require a license to purchase. First aid information is also listed, usually very quickly on the label. It's what you need to do in case of an emergency. You'll find specific words and signal words on the label. There's danger or poison, which indicates a very high toxicity, which requires less than a teaspoon to be considered lethal. And skull and crossbones is often used as the symbol. I don't think I've seen too many chemicals listed with this level of toxicity, but that's the labeling. So you'll see the words danger and poison with the skull and crossbones. There is warning, which means a moderate risk or moderate toxicity with a teaspoon to a tablespoon or so. And you'll see the word warning posted on that as a symbol. And then the last is caution. In most every other chemical that didn't fall in the other two categories will carry this caution label. The low toxicity may take an ounce or more, and you'll simply see the word caution on the label. The trade name of this, okay. Trade name, the product, the function of the pesticide. These are all things we're going to be looking for as we go through and look at the actual pesticide. What equipment, personal protective equipment that you need. When can you go back into the area? Are also things that may be mentioned in the label. How much of that chemical can be used or should be applied to a given area? So let's look at the actual label. Okay. Okay, so nothing isn't working, right? So give me just a second to, there we go. So the first one I'm bringing up is a lawn weed killer with crabgrass, listed as one of the controls. So this is going to have several things in it to control your lawn weeds and your crabgrass. It says this product's exclusive formula kills lawn weeds plus crabgrass in one easy step and will not harm your lawn if used as directed. It says when used as directed. But if you follow the label, then you're going to get the results that you desire. Tells you how big of an area it treats, 5,000 square feet. So this, according to their label, makes it ideal for large areas. It's rainproof in an hour, and you're controlling your lawn. It's never been used. So after you get past their advertisement, you come to that precautionary statement. It's a caution label. So it can be hazardous to humans and domestic animals if swallowed, and it can cause eye irritation. It goes on to list all the things that need to be done. It says when using this product, wear a long sleeve shirt, long pants, sock shoes, and rubber gloves. It gives you the protection equipment that you need as well. Next is the first aid. What to do: swallow, call the poison control center or a doctor immediately. Have a person sip a glass of water if able to swallow. Sometimes it says no water, no nothing, just, depending on the chemical and what it is. Do not induce vomiting unless told so to do so by poison control center or doctor. So once you've contacted the professionals, you need to follow their instructions. And if in the eyes, it gives you the instructions as well. It also gives you the contact information for the Poison Control Center. And those guys can be pretty helpful if you need them. I've actually had to call them once. Active ingredients: 4.85% 2,4-D dimethylene salt, 0.45% dicambia, which is a dimethylene salt as well, which the dimethylene salt is the way in which that product is being delivered. And this chloric is 1.67%. We have the first two listed are for the actual weeds that is coming up, and the last one is actually your pre-emergent crabgrass grenade. So they have the environmental hazards listed so that you can read through that. And basically it says don't pour it down the drain. And then some other information regarding research and testing has determined that directions for use are appropriate for proper use of this product under accepted conditions. So if you follow directions and do when and how, it says Bayer, will assume the responsibility for lack of performance. But if you do not follow the label and don't do it right, then they have no responsibility. Bayer, or the buyer assumes responsibility for lack of performance or safety if not according to directions. Actually, I said that right. Bayer does accept some of the responsibility for it if it doesn't work if you follow the label correctly. But if you don't, it's your responsibility. It's in Spanish as well as English. So here's some quick facts. Broadleaf weeds, up to 200 other weeds besides those listed. Tells you what kind of grass. And notice it says do not use on. And we don't have Bahia carpet grass or centipede grass, St. Augustine grass in this area. That tends to be further south. But it can be applied to Bermuda grass, fescue, zoysia, bluegrass, ryegrass. However, it does warn you that Bermuda grass can be temporarily damaged or discolored when using this chemical. So in another list of active ingredients and the product full label of actually it's not what I'm trying to say is this part right here. This where it has the 2,4-D and goes on with the full chemical name. The EPA numbers that I mentioned, and this says batch number and all the other information that tells you when, where, and how it was produced. So all that information's there on it. So as you go through, do not mow for 1 to 2 days before spraying. Clippings from the first 3 mowings should be left on the untreated area. So once you treat, and next 2 or 3 times you mow, it says don't pick up the clippings. The one that gives the clippings, clippings will carry some of that herbicide with them if you put them in your compost pile or dispose of them. And do not use the clippings as mulch around flowers, ornamentals, trees, or in the vegetable garden. Water 2 to 3 days before, and it's rain fast an hour after application. So hopefully you don't get a rain shower. Then it lists for the next page. And nearly 2 pages. All the different weeds that this chemical will control. And then toward the end, this is always important as well to think about. Storage conditions and how to store it properly. And this in particular, you need to know how to dispose of the container when it's empty and how to dispose of any leftover chemical that you may have. And that's what I was saying, when you're thinking about buying or need to buy a chemical, don't go buy a 2-gallon jug to treat 2 or 3 little spots. It might be more economical to spend a little more money to buy a smaller quantity and not have any leftover chemical to either have to store or to try to dispose of. It tells you what to do and who to call to ask those questions, but it's not always the easiest thing to do, but you have to find the right way to do it. And the label keeps going on with the Spanish label. So that's some of the things that you would find on a herbicide label. An insecticide label will look very much the same. And you got the pretty outside with their advertisement and the little catch, makes you look at it and want to buy it. Reading a little further into the label may help you understand better what the chemical will do. This one kills Japanese beetles, cutworms, and tomato hornworms, and other listed pests. Also rainproof in an hour. But you'll see it's the very same format. Cautionary statements, first aid, the EPA registration, some of the quick facts, and then just what it kills, some of the targeted pest, how much 60 makes up to 64 gallons of spray and covers 5,333 square feet if you're applying for a lawn. If you're buying this size container, and I don't remember what size container I've pulled this before, back up, it should tell on the right here, 32 fluid ounces. So if you have a small garden, you may not be making 64 applications in the course of the year. So it can be used on vegetables, lawns, ground covers, flowers, shrubs, and around homes, but it doesn't say in the home. That's something else to think about. It's labeled for outside use. It says when to use, when insects or damage first appear. Of course, that's what they want you to do, because you're going to start spraying immediately as soon as the problem shows up. If you go back to the integrated pest management steps and processes, when the insect first appears, or the damage first appears, it may not be significant enough to warrant a spraying. And it may be that the insect and the damage it caused may not be significant enough to even need to spray at all. So that's where knowing the pest and knowing what you can tolerate as far as the damage can be very helpful. Then it gives you a quick how much to use, a tablespoon per gallon of water. And then it tells you it says when to harvest. This will be that re-entry interval or the time. And it says see the specific restrictions for pre-harvest interval. So there are certain plants that may vary, and then it gives you active ingredient here. So as you scroll down, if you're using this for lawns, then it tells you how to use a hose-in sprayer. So there's also these directions. Before you use, here's some things you need to to do, particularly read and follow directions. When to use it, some of the other mixes, and all this is for for the various ways in which you're going to be applying. Types of sprayers and how to mix with those types of sprayers. And then back on the right-hand side, it has this information of when. You'll notice if you were after the yellow striped armyworm, you want them early in the development stage when they're still caterpillar. If you're after the fall armyworm, you want them early as well. So it tells you a good target time and also what pests on what plants. Here on fruiting vegetables, eggplant, peppers, including most any pepper, tomatoes, it says do not apply more than 6 times per season. You have a 7-day harvest interval. So you cannot, if you spray, you've got to wait 7 days before you can harvest, except for tomatoes. For brassicas, you can't spray more than 4 times per season. And you notice it doesn't mention a harvest interval. So if it's not mentioned according to the label, then there is no harvest interval. And you can keep it every possible crop that you could apply. All that information is there. How many times you can spray, when you can go back in. If you notice, peanuts, 14 days. Sunflowers do not harvest for at least 30 days after application. Then it goes on to the fruits, 3 days for grapes. And I'm not going to spend much more time on this, but notice all of this when you're reading the labels. And sometimes it might not hurt to stand there in the store and read that label before you take it home. Make sure you're getting the product that's going to work for you. and then it reminds you again not to water for an hour. People and pets may re-enter the treated area after it has dried for lawns. I think, that's probably best to give it overnight in most cases. Just make sure it is dry. So that's basically what labels look like, and they vary from company to company as to the layout. But typically, the sequence of information is the same and presented in very much that same format as Bayer's. Now, I'm not promoting Bayer by any means. They just happen to have easily accessible labels when I started looking them up. Most companies have their labels in PDFs online, so if you're doing a little research before you go and buy, then you can bring up that label, the latest label, and read it. But I would certainly keep the label that you from the chemical that you purchased. It's best to keep it with the container. That way you will know exactly what is what, and keep them in the original container so that you can identify what you have and what you're using. So this may be a good time to pause and ask if there's any questions on reading pesticide labels. No questions? Well, then we will move on to the next section. The equipment that you would use to apply comes in all kinds of shapes, sizes, types, prices, and you need to select the right equipment for the job that you want to do. And being able to apply that pesticide properly, that means having the right equipment, is going to be key to the success of that pesticide and whether or not it will actually accomplish what you want to accomplish. So having the right equipment is important. So before you go and buy equipment, think about how big a job you are actually going to have. Are you going to be spraying a large garden, a yard, or a small garden, maybe a few small raised beds? Are you going to need a gallon sprayer, or are you going to need a 2-gallon sprayer? So how big the equipment needs to fit the job. Now the other thing to think about with the size of the equipment is how you're going to be using it. Pump up hand sprayer, you're going to be carrying it. Water weighs about 7 pounds per gallon. So 14, 15 pounds for a 2-gallon sprayer could be more than you might want to tote around. So the size of the equipment may also fit what you want to use. What kind of chemicals are you going to be applying? Most lawn and garden chemicals that you're going to be applying as a concentrated mixing, a plastic sprayer would work, but you can also find them in stainless steel. The amount of water needed for spraying, with most lawn and garden labels, they're going to tell you how to mix per gallon. So they're going to be labeled and give you instructions per gallon. So that's pretty straightforward. But will that gallon cover 2 or 3 plants, depending on how much is needed, or is it going to cover a 10 by 10 flower bed? So knowing how much water is needed for the job may be important as well. The size of the plants to be treated. If you're talking about fruit trees, then you're going to be a fairly large plant. Something in your garden, then they're going to be much smaller. And the type of sprayer you might use on your trees is definitely going to be different than what you could use in a garden. And then another consideration is just how much are you willing to spend on equipment. I will say this, when it comes to spending the money, you can buy inexpensive sprayers just about anywhere. And they may do the job if you maintain them and keep them clean and use them properly. But sometimes spending a little extra money for a little better quality may last you longer and get more uses out of it for your money. So in the long run, you may actually come out cheaper. One more thing, kinds of chemicals. Probably need to mention this. If you do use both insecticides and herbicides, I would have a sprayer for each, labeled for each, marked very clearly so that you know this is what I'm spraying the garden for bugs with, and the other is what I'm going to spray the yard for weeds with. 2,4-D is one of those chemicals which is difficult to rinse out of a sprayer. So if you happen to use 2,4-D as a weed control in your yard, or spray the poison ivy on the fence row, or climbing up a tree in the backyard, then you might just need to buy a small sprayer and label it for that purpose and use it just for that particular chemical. And we'll talk a little bit before we finish on how to care for this equipment. But they might need a couple or 3 different sprayers depending on what chemicals you plan to use and how much spraying you plan to do. Personal protective equipment is also important. Rubber gloves is going to be on all of the labels. And they'll often recommend that you have long pants and closed-toed shoes and long-sleeve shirts. Very rarely will you find for lawn and garden the need for all of the protective equipment that's listed here. However, goggles probably wouldn't be a bad thought, particularly if you're spraying tall plants and you're going to be spraying up above your waist anyway. You know, it would be a good idea to have eye protection. Having your sprayer calibrated is important. Now, I'm going to back up one step. It shows a picture of a spreader type, which may be used for granular applications of some insecticides or even preventive pre-emergent herbicides for crabgrass. And calibrating those spreaders were just like the calibrating of the fertilizer spreaders, that video we looked at a couple of weeks ago. So that's pretty straightforward. You lay off the area, length, figure out how much coverage you get from your spreader, and how much material you put out for the setting on your spreader. And it's important that you do this because you want to put the right rate of pesticide down so that you can be most effective and economical in the process. Too much can be dangerous, too little won't get the job done. So calibrate your sprayer. And you can do this with a hand sprayer or a backpack sprayer. And the thing to do is to fill the sprayer with water and pressurize it. So if it's one of those pump-up sprayers, pump it up thoroughly. And then spray the water into a pint jar. You may want to do this when it's new before you put any chemicals in, so that all you're using is water. So spray for 30 seconds and measure the amount of water you collected in ounces. The next thing you need to do is to spray an area while walking at a normal speed for 30 seconds. So just spray the water out as you walk and measure the area sprayed in square feet. So figure out how wide the spray is, so figure out where you're going to hold the sprayer, how high above the ground, and then measure the distance that you walked in that 30 seconds. So your length times your width gives you the square feet. So if 30 seconds of spraying delivered 8 fluid ounces, and you managed to walk and cover an area of 100 square feet in that 30 seconds, so it would take 80 ounces of water to spray 1,000 square feet. So and it shows you the math. The pesticide calls for 3 tablespoons per 1,000 square foot of area. Then you would mix 3 tablespoons in 80 ounces of water. Now, if you have a gallon sprayer, that's probably going to be a little easy to do and do the math. But if you've got a smaller sprayer, then you may need to divide that rate up to fit the amount of water in the area you're actually covering per spray. So doing a little math, figure out how much water you need and how big your sprayer is. This little conversion chart might be handy. There is some labels that will tell you per 100 gallons, but very few of the lawn and garden labels actually have it. Most of them are per gallon. If you ask for a quarter of a pint per 100 gallons, then you're putting a quarter teaspoon per gallon. A pint per 100 is a teaspoon per gallon. Quarts, 2 teaspoons, you can read the rest of those, but it's a pretty straightforward conversion. It's asking for a ½ pound of dry measure material per 100 gallons of the wettable powder. Then you need a 1/12 of an ounce. Pound per 100 gallons would be a 1/6 of an ounce. So you're going to be dealing with some pretty small amounts. Something else to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, there are restricted use pesticides, and these pesticides are packaged for specific uses. And these often come in larger quantities and are more concentrated than what you would need for your home use. And you can buy, excuse me, you can buy the Roundup in 2.5 gallons. You can buy it in quart containers. But those packaged for home use are in small quantities, pints, quarts, sometimes even ounces and pounds. And the label will give you the mix in teaspoons, tablespoons per 1,000 square foot and or per gallon of water, and then tell you how much of the mix to apply per 1,000 square foot. You buy it in larger quantities, the commercial packaging, then there are going to be other considerations. They're going to be per acre, per 100-gallon tank mixes. Those concentrates or those levels or those labels may require protective clothing that is not listed for the smaller quantities, the smaller concentrates that are in the lawn, garden, and home use. So for your home and lawn garden use, if you're not needing the larger quantities, then purchasing what you need that's labeled for your lawn and garden would be a good recommendation. Safety. You notice the first one, read the label. You may hear me say that again a couple of times before we finish this evening. If it lists protective clothing or specific clothing recommendations for the clothing that you need to wear, then you need to wear that protective clothing. Check your equipment, make sure it's working. Make sure that you have everything in good order before you start, because it's going to be very important that you have it working so that you don't get a tank full of or a sprayer full of something and then find out the sprayer doesn't work correctly. Windy days is not a good time to be applying pesticides because you can get drift. First of all, you may do damage to something you don't want damage. You may drift onto your flowers, it's spraying the weeds in your yard. And then you're not targeting the pest. You're not actually accomplishing the task that you want. On really warm days, and during the warm part of the day, you need to avoid spraying because a lot of these chemicals will vaporize in warm days. Anything above 80 degrees typically can start seeing vaporization of chemicals, particularly some of the herbicides that are used on lawns and turf. And just clear the area. No one needs to be in the area, and keep the pets away from the area while you're treating. And then follow that reentry recommendation that is on the label. All right, cleaning your equipment. Once you're finished, and this, again, I've been talking in general terms here, but I do want to remind you that we're talking about any chemical or pesticide that you may be applying, whether it be labeled for organic purposes or whether it be a more conventional method. All of this applies. So if you pick up neem oil for an insecticide, it has a label, and you need to follow those label recommendations. If you pick up a erythroid or permethrin, which are more synthetic, again, the label needs to be followed. So once you've accomplished your spraying, you need to clean all the spraying equipment inside and out with clean water after use. Flush the hoses and nozzles of any hose and sprayers with clean water as well. Do not dump the rinse water in a place where it can become a pollutant. That first rinse, it's a good idea probably to go back and respray it over an area that you want treated. And that, for one, you're putting it back in an area where it's targeting. You're not going to be adding a lot of extra material as far as the label is concerned and putting too much. But that first rinse of your equipment, maybe just need to go back and spray the labeled area, the area that you were targeting with it. Never, ever dump them down the drain. What we would recommend is for pump up sprayers, what I would suggest is fill it with clean water and shake it really good for a little bit, and then flush all that water through the spray nozzle. And then do that 2 more times. So you actually are triple rinsing the equipment inside and out. So it's not really necessary to add to your sprayer. You may want to wash the outside with soap and water if there's any dirt or other material that needs to be removed. But triple rinsing and flushing out the whole sprayer is important. And then let it drain and dry before you store it, so that you're not putting it up, and if there's any metal parts or anything with rust. So cleaning your equipment is important. Storage. Always store in the original containers, which I've already mentioned. Make sure the label stays on the containers. A locked cabinet, room, or building is recommended, particularly if you have children or pets that may be in the area and can get into that space. Protect from temperature extremes. We don't want a room that gets extremely warm during the summer or could freeze during the winter. But it needs to be in an area where it will be some control of the temperature. Sometimes the labels will suggest that you store in an area above a certain temperature and keep in a cool, dry place, above a certain temperature or within a certain temperature range. Do not store close to wells and water sources. And certainly do not keep it in the same place that you may store food, drinks, medical supplies, veterinary supplies, equipment, pet food, anything that it may contaminate. They need to have your lawn and garden chemicals and fertilizers need to have their own storage place so that they can be kept without contaminating anything. So it shows you on the label where to find the disposal instructions, what to do with the containers. Most of the time it recommends emptying the containers and rinsing them 3 times. So when you empty a container, or about to empty a container, rinse it into your sprayer. So use that water from your rinse. It's part of the water that you're going to use in the mix. Wrap in newspaper and simply put it in the trash. Do not reuse the containers. Sometimes it will recommend that you puncture the container so that it cannot be reused. Buy what you need and use it according to the label. Because leftover chemicals can be difficult to handle, difficult to store. That's what I said earlier. You may spend a little extra money for a premix ready to use, but if that's exactly what you need and that's all you're going to need it for is that one-time application to solve a problem, then that may just be the best way to go. Then you won't have to worry about the leftovers in disposal. Some things to keep in mind is the symptoms of poisoning. You're going to be using these, if you're using them according to the label and using them with the proper protective equipment, then there shouldn't be any problems. But there are some things to keep in mind. And no matter what chemical we're talking about, they're going to affect the body in different ways. And the dosage and the amount or the level of poisoning can be needs to be considered as well. Because if you have mild poisoning or a mild dose, you may just feel, you may not feel good. You may feel fatigued, have a little headache, or maybe a little lightheadedness or blood vision, nausea, but it may not be anything more severe than that. And you may think, well, I'm just not feeling good. So, be careful and watch for these potential signs. As you move on, the moderate poisoning gets a little more extreme. It can be weakness, the inability to walk. Muscles may twitch. There's constriction of the pupils of the eyes. All the other symptoms become more acute and more severe, like you just mentioned. There can be some discomfort or difficulty breathing or tightness in the chest. And as the level or dose gets higher, they can be more severe symptoms. It can be unconsciousness, a severe constriction of the eye pupils, convulsions, difficulty breathing. And these symptoms may not happen immediately. They could show up a little later after after you've been exposed. Far enough removed, by a couple of hours or so, that you may not necessarily make the connection. But if the symptoms are severe enough and the dosage is severe enough, it could be dangerous. So just simply pay attention, for those signs. First aid, the statement on the label needs to be followed. And it is, the first thing that we saw on the two labels that we looked at is what to do in case of an emergency. So if it's on the skin, remove it as quickly as possible by flushing with water. Contaminated clothing needs to be removed. And if it's contaminated severely enough, you may not want to worry about washing them and just simply dispose them. Then clean your hair and fingernails as well. If it's inhaled fresh air, loose and tight clothing so the person can breathe easier, and doctor's care. And it says, do not administer anything to poison victims unless you're trained in first aid. And that's where calling a doctor and getting the medical advice from a doctor or from the Poison Control Center is necessary. They're going to direct you in what to do. Pesticides often get mentioned as being problems in the environment, and when they're not properly used or when they're moved off target, they can be problems. And the biggest problem comes with the misapplication. And it can affect bees and other pollinators. So don't spray any insecticides when a plant is in bloom. Drift to nearby crops or landscapes can be a problem if you are spraying on a windy day or on a really warm day. It can be a problem to fish and other aquatic life, particularly if you are spraying it in an area close to water or actually spray the water. or it runs off into that water source. So when choosing a method or chemical that you want to use, the least hazardous chemical is the first choice. So the whole idea of the integrated pest management is to find the best, most effective method of control that's going to cause the least amount of problems. So the least hazardous chemical would be the product of choice. And as I noted a few minutes ago, I cannot think of any lawn, garden, or even home pesticides that you can buy now over the counter that carries anything greater than a caution label. So their risk of toxicity is fairly low in comparison to some of the other choices that may be out there. If you happen to have a spill, there are three things, and there are three C's to pesticide spills: control, contain, and clean up. So the first thing you want to do is to protect yourself. So the protective equipment that was mentioned earlier may be necessary. You need to stop the source. That may be as simple as setting the bottle back up so that it doesn't continue to pour, or putting it into another container if it happens to be punctured. Protect others, so keeping others away from the area, and stay at the site. If it's in your garage or your outbuilding or something, just don't walk away and say, I'll take care of that later. Stay there and make sure you contain and clean up. So confine the spill. Don't let it spread anymore. If it's a liquid, you may put something down to as a barrier to keep it from spreading. If it's a dust, then it's not a problem. Absorb the liquids. Kitty litter works really well for most cases. Dry material, you may just simply need to cover that up until you can clean it up. Decontaminate the spill site. For liquid spills, absorbent material such as kitty litter, sweep up and place in a plastic bag, and then follow the label for proper disposal of a pesticide. So you treat it as if it was leftover pesticide. If it's a dry spill, then if it's not contaminated with other things, when you sweep it up, you could reuse that material. Turning on the water hose and just spraying it down and washing it out is really not going to be a good practice, because then you're just simply moving that off-site. If it happens to be a herbicide and you spray it out the door of your building, then you just killed all the grass and plants around that building. So hosing it down is not recommended. It says neutralize the spill site. So the labels will have some information. You may tell you to add something to it to neutralize. Most of your lawn and garden chemicals will not get in there because they can simply be absorbed with something absorbent like kitty litter, or swept up if it happens to be the right material. Again, pesticide label is the law, and under the federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Herbicide Act of 1972, it is illegal to use a pesticide on a plant unless the plant is listed on the label. So, read the label. Make sure you are getting the correct pesticide. You cannot exceed the rate on the label. I would highly recommend that when you are reading the label, it will give you typically a range of chemicals. So a rate, it may say from 6 to 8 teaspoons per gallon of water. I would stay within that range. If you use too little of the material, you may not be effective, but you certainly cannot legally exceed the label rate. And you're liable for the misuse, including drift, leaching, and other misuses of that pesticide. There is those general use pesticides, which we mentioned earlier, are those primarily for home and lawn garden use. And you buy those basically over the counter, and as long as you're using them according to the label, there's not a lot of concern. Restricted use is mostly for farm and commercial use. You must be certified to buy these restricted use pesticides. And you present a card when you buy, and then you have to keep records of what is being used. Those restricted use chemicals, most of those carry caution labels as well. And the labels are very similar to the labels that you would see on the lawn and garden, just larger quantities and larger areas treated. But the biggest thing with the restricted use is the keeping of the records. You've got to know exactly where you applied it and how much you applied, when you applied it, and some other questions that are asked on the record forms. Those record forms can be audited. So follow the safety precautions and use common sense. Before buying a pesticide, you simply know what the pest is and if it's going to be a problem, and what you need to do to control the pest. And then find the least toxic method or pesticide to apply. As I said, with weeds, it maybe simply is pulling the weed, or maybe your best option. But if you need to use a pesticide, always read the label. So, like last week, we're finishing up a little earlier than the scheduled 2 hours, which I'm sure for those of you who have joined us every week, you're fine with. This would be a good time for questions. Questions, anyone? Okay, so what do you all think about this internal recording session? We're now finished with the official